There is a quiet assumption that follows anyone whose circle is small. People look at distance and immediately attach a story to it. They assume isolation, difficulty, social failure. They imagine someone who struggles to connect, someone who cannot maintain relationships, someone who simply has not figured out how to belong. That assumption is comforting for the crowd. It protects a certain narrative, the idea that connection always means health, that the more people around you, the more balanced your life must be. But reality rarely works that way. A small circle does not always mean you failed to connect. Often it means you stopped pretending to. There comes a point in a person's development when social noise begins to feel different. Conversations that once felt normal begin to feel repetitive. Interactions that once felt harmless begin to feel performative. You start noticing how much energy is spent maintaining appearances that no one truly believes. This is the moment where something shifts internally, not loudly, quietly. You begin withdrawing from exchanges that demand constant emotional participation without offering anything real in return. Not because you hate people, not because you think you are better, because the cost of constant interaction becomes obvious. And once you see that cost, it is difficult to unsee. Your circle shrinks not through rejection, but through clarity. What remains after that process tends to reveal something unusual about the person who went through it. People with small circles often share a set of traits that are rarely discussed openly because they challenge the social story most people rely on. The first trait is a high tolerance for solitude, not loneliness, solitude. Those two states are often confused, but they are not the same. Loneliness is the pain of missing connection. Solitude is the absence of noise. Most people fear that absence. Silence creates psychological pressure. Without conversation, distraction, or validation, the mind turns inward. Thoughts become louder. Doubts become clearer. Unanswered questions appear. This is why constant interaction is so appealing. It fills the space where self-confrontation would otherwise occur. People with small circles learn to sit in that space without panic. They are able to move through entire stretches of time without needing social reinforcement to confirm their value. Their mood does not depend on someone replying to a message. Their identity does not require constant reflection through other people. This ability changes everything. Because once you become comfortable being alone, social interaction stops being a necessity. It becomes a choice. And when something becomes a choice, your standards change immediately. You no longer tolerate interactions that drain attention. You no longer invest energy into conversations that circle endlessly without direction. You become selective. Selectivity shrinks circles very quickly. The second trait is a low tolerance for performative behavior. Social environments run heavily on performance. People manage tone carefully. They exaggerate enthusiasm. They soften disagreement. They signal belonging through gestures that have little to do with what they actually think. None of this is necessarily malicious. It is simply the currency of group harmony. But once you become sensitive to it, the pattern becomes difficult to ignore. You begin noticing the pauses where people adjust their language before speaking. You hear the difference between what someone says and what they actually mean. You see how often agreement appears where genuine alignment does not exist. For someone who values precision, this becomes exhausting. Not because they expect perfection, but because constant performance requires constant participation. If everyone else is performing, you are expected to perform too. Some people refuse. When they do, their circle shrinks. Because the people who prefer performance feel uncomfortable around someone who does not participate in it. Authentic responses disrupt the rhythm of the group. Silence, where enthusiasm is expected, creates tension. Eventually, the distance grows naturally. What remains are people who do not require masks. The third trait is emotional independence. This is one of the most misunderstood traits a person can have. Emotional independence does not mean coldness. It does not mean someone lacks empathy or refuses connection. It simply means their emotional stability does not depend on the behavior of others. If someone leaves, they adjust. If someone disagrees, they remain calm. If someone misunderstands them, they do not rush to repair the perception. Most people find this unsettling because it removes a familiar lever of control. In many relationships, emotional influence is subtle but constant. Tone shifts to signal disappointment. Silence communicates disapproval. Approval is granted or withdrawn in ways that guide behavior. Emotional independence disrupts that entire structure. A person who cannot be easily pushed into guilt, urgency, or reassurance is difficult to manage. Conversations become cleaner, but also less predictable. For those who rely on emotional leverage, distance becomes the easiest response. Once again, the circle shrinks. The fourth trait is a strong internal filter. Most people absorb social input without realizing it. Opinions from friends, family, co-workers, and strangers blend together until they form an invisible pressure that shapes decisions. You see it everywhere. Someone changes direction because others question them. Someone delays action because they fear judgment. Someone avoids speaking honestly because the reaction might disrupt the atmosphere. People with small circles tend to filter this input differently. They listen, but they do not absorb automatically. Every opinion passes through an internal evaluation. Does this align with reality? Does this come from experience? Does this serve the direction I am moving in? If the answer is no, the opinion stops there. It does not linger. This filter creates distance in social environments where shared belief is treated as loyalty. When someone refuses to adopt the emotional tone of the group automatically, they appear detached. Detached people rarely attract large circles, but they maintain clarity. The fifth trait is patience with silence. Silence is one of the most revealing forces in human interaction. Most people rush to fill it. They talk to avoid awkwardness. They laugh to smooth tension. They explain more than necessary to maintain comfort. But silence exposes things that words hide. It reveals who becomes nervous first. It shows who needs validation. It shows who is comfortable simply observing. People who live with small circles often become fluent in silence. They do not treat pauses as problems. They allow conversations to slow down naturally. They do not chase responses or force energy into an interaction that is fading. This ability makes them appear calm, sometimes distant. But what it actually reflects is control over their own tempo. And tempo is power in any interaction. The person who does not rush is rarely the one being led. The sixth trait is resistance to social obligation. Many relationships are maintained not through genuine connection, but through expectation. Attend this event, respond to this message. Maintain this routine interaction even if nothing meaningful is exchanged. Most people comply automatically because social systems reward compliance with belonging. But belonging comes with a price: time, attention, energy. People with small circles tend to calculate that cost differently. They ask a question others rarely ask openly. Is this interaction necessary? If the answer is no, they withdraw. Not dramatically, quietly. Over time, these small withdrawals reshape their social environment. The invitations slow down, the conversations narrow, the circle tightens. What remains are interactions chosen deliberately rather than maintained by habit. The seventh trait is an unusual relationship with approval. Approval drives a surprising amount of human behavior. People adjust their opinions, tone, appearance, and even ambitions to remain inside the acceptable range of their group. Approval creates safety, but it also creates limits. People with very small circles tend to detach from this mechanism earlier than most. They still understand approval. They simply do not depend on it. If their view conflicts with the room, they remain quiet or speak directly. If their direction does not match expectations, they continue anyway. If their choices create distance, they accept it. This posture is not rebellious. It is independent. Independence is expensive socially. It removes many automatic connections that form through shared validation. But it also removes pressure. Once approval is no longer necessary, interactions become simpler. You speak when there is something to say. You listen when the other person is worth hearing. Everything else fades. At this stage, the size of your circle stops being a concern entirely, because you realize something that most people never question. Connection and quantity were never the same thing. Large circles often run on momentum rather than depth. People remain because everyone else remains. Familiarity replaces intention. Small circles, when they exist by choice, operate differently. Every person present remains there because the interaction holds value. No one is there out of habit alone. This creates a quiet stability. The conversations are slower. The trust is deeper. The expectations are fewer. You no longer feel pressured to maintain constant motion socially. And with that stillness, something else becomes visible. How much of ordinary social life runs on fear? Fear of exclusion, fear of misinterpretation, fear of being alone with your own thoughts. Once those fears lose their hold, your behavior changes without effort. You stop chasing invitations. You stop maintaining relationships that survive only through obligation. You stop explaining why you prefer fewer voices in your environment. Not because you believe your way is superior, because you understand the trade. Large circles offer constant movement. Small circles offer clarity. Clarity tends to attract only a few people, and that is enough. By the time this realization settles fully, the need to measure your life through the number of people around you disappears. Presence becomes more important than proximity. A few people who understand your pace are worth more than dozens who require constant adjustment. You begin to see that a small circle is not an absence. It is a filter built slowly through experience, observation, and a willingness to tolerate solitude long enough for the noise to fall away. And once the noise falls away, something interesting happens. Your attention returns to you. You stop performing versions of yourself designed to fit different rooms. You stop rehearsing conversations before they happen. You stop managing impressions. The energy that once fed constant interaction becomes available again, available for thought, for movement, for decisions that are not negotiated through a group. This is the part few people notice from the outside. They see distance and assume loss. But from the inside, the feeling is different, quieter, heavier, clearer. And once you experience that clarity, reacting emotionally to the size of your circle begins to feel strangely primitive, because numbers were never the point. The point was freedom, and freedom rarely requires a crowd. Once someone reaches this stage, something subtle begins to happen in the way they observe people. Conversations stop feeling like exchanges of information. They begin to feel like signals. You start noticing patterns that once blended into the background. Who speaks quickly when silence appears? Who exaggerates confidence when uncertainty enters the room? Who laughs too loudly when approval is being measured? None of these behaviors are necessarily dishonest. They are adaptive. People adjust themselves constantly to maintain stability inside groups. Social belonging requires continuous calibration. But once you stop needing belonging in the same way, those calibrations become visible. You see the machinery behind the interaction. And once you see it, participation changes. You speak less, not because you have less to say, but because you recognize how often words are used to manage perception rather than communicate reality. You notice how frequently conversations orbit the same themes: reputation, validation, comparison. These patterns dominate large social circles because large circles require constant reinforcement. When many people share the same space, harmony becomes a priority. Harmony requires smoothing rough edges. It requires silence around inconvenient truths. A person with a small circle gradually stops performing this smoothing function. They do not disrupt conversations deliberately. They simply stop contributing to the invisible maintenance work that keeps everything comfortable. Comfortable environments prefer predictable personalities. When someone becomes unpredictable, the atmosphere shifts. Others sense it before they understand it. This is another reason small circles form. The moment you stop reinforcing the emotional rhythm of a group, the group begins adjusting around you. Some people lean closer out of curiosity. Others step back because the rhythm no longer feels familiar. The people who remain tend to share one thing in common. They are comfortable with psychological friction. Friction is rare in most social environments. People instinctively move away from it. Disagreement, silence, honesty that lands too directly, questions that expose uncertainty. All of these create small disturbances in the emotional surface of a group. Groups smooth those disturbances quickly, but individuals who live comfortably with small circles tend to move in the opposite direction. They tolerate friction long enough to see what emerges from it. Friction reveals character. When agreement disappears, people show how they actually think. When silence stretches longer than usual, intentions become easier to read. When approval is removed, behavior changes. This is where another trait begins to show itself. People with small circles develop a sharper sense of psychological timing. They notice when someone is speaking to fill space rather than communicate meaning. They notice when a compliment is offered not as appreciation, but as leverage. They notice when enthusiasm is exaggerated to influence perception. Timing becomes the lens through which everything is interpreted. What was said matters less than when it was said. A delayed answer, a rushed explanation, a question that appears exactly when tension rises. These details become obvious to someone who spends long periods observing rather than participating. Observation is the quiet advantage of solitude. When your environment is filled with constant interaction, attention is fragmented. You respond to messages, reactions, invitations, expectations. Your mind moves from stimulus to stimulus, with very little space in between. But solitude slows that cycle. Without constant input, perception sharpens. You begin noticing things that move too quickly in crowded environments. You notice how often people talk about themselves indirectly through stories about others. You notice how frequently humor is used to disguise criticism. You notice how many conversations are actually negotiations over status. These realizations change the way you choose your company. Not everyone enjoys being seen clearly. In fact, most people prefer environments where observation is shallow. Shallow observation protects social harmony. Deep observation exposes contradictions. People who develop a taste for depth naturally become selective, not because they distrust others, because they recognize how rarely genuine alignment appears. Alignment is different from agreement. Agreement is easy. It can be offered politely, even when it is not fully believed. Alignment requires shared perception. Two people recognizing the same reality without needing to negotiate it into existence. That kind of connection does not appear often. Which brings us to another trait people with small circles tend to carry. They invest slowly. Most social relationships begin with enthusiasm. Two people meet, discover common interests, and accelerate quickly into familiarity. Messages become frequent. Plans are made quickly. Emotional disclosure appears earlier than it probably should. Acceleration creates excitement, but it also hides information. People who have learned to live with smaller circles resist this acceleration. They allow time to pass before trust becomes deep. They observe how someone behaves across different situations, how they respond to disagreement, how they treat absence, how they handle silence. Trust forms through pattern, not intensity. When trust forms slowly, fewer people qualify, which again reduces the size of the circle. By now you may notice something interesting about these traits. None of them involve superiority. There is no requirement for intelligence, talent, or strength. The traits are mostly about tolerance. Tolerance for solitude, tolerance for silence, tolerance for friction, tolerance for misinterpretation, tolerance for the uncomfortable space, where clarity slowly replaces illusion. Most people do not remain in that space for long. The pressure becomes too strong. They return to environments where interaction is easier and validation arrives quickly. There is nothing wrong with that choice. But people who remain outside that cycle long enough begin to see something else. Social approval is not always a measure of value. Often, it is a measure of compliance. Groups reward the behaviors that keep the group stable. People who maintain the emotional rhythm of the group receive warmth. People who question that rhythm receive distance. Once you understand this, approval stops carrying the same weight. Not because you reject it, because you understand what it represents. This understanding produces a strange calm in social situations. You stop measuring yourself through reactions. Someone disagrees. The conversation continues. Someone misunderstands. You allow the misunderstanding to exist. Someone withdraws. The absence is accepted without pursuit. These responses feel unusual to people who rely on constant feedback to maintain connection. Without feedback, they assume something must be wrong. But for someone whose circle is small by design, feedback is not required for stability. Stability comes from internal alignment rather than external reflection. And that internal alignment is what ultimately determines the size of a person's circle. The more your identity depends on external confirmation, the larger your circle must be to sustain it. The less you depend on that confirmation, the fewer people are needed around you. Eventually, the difference becomes obvious. Some people maintain dozens of connections that require continuous attention to remain alive. Messages, invitations, shared events, group conversations that rarely pause. Others maintain a handful of relationships that can remain silent for long periods without weakening. Silence becomes neutral rather than threatening. A week passes without contact. Nothing changes. A month passes. The connection remains intact. These relationships operate on recognition rather than constant reinforcement. Recognition of character, recognition of pace, recognition of shared perception. When two people recognize those things in each other, distance does not dissolve the connection. It simply leaves space around it. And space, as strange as it may sound, is often the final trait shared by those with the smallest circles. They protect space the way others protect reputation. Space for thought, space for independence. Space where their attention is not constantly negotiated by the expectations of a group. From the outside, this space can look like absence. But from the inside, it feels like control. Control over where your energy goes. Control over which voices enter your environment. Control over when interaction begins and when it ends. That control is quiet. It does not announce itself. It simply becomes visible in the shape of a person's life. A life where the circle remains small, not because it could not be larger, because nothing important requires it to be. And when that realization settles completely, the old anxiety around numbers fades. The question stops being how many people are around you. The question becomes something else entirely. Who remains when nothing is required? Those few people are enough. Everything else was noise.